I wasn't doing anything dramatic when it happened. No heavy rain outside, no sad music in the background. Just a quiet morning where the kettle was whistling a little too loud, and I was thinking about whether I'd forgotten to water the plants again. Sigh. The kind of ordinary moment you never expect to become the line that splits your life into before and after, ha ha ha. And that's the strange thing about betrayal. It never announces itself properly. It just slips into your day like it belongs there. So when my phone rang and I saw my son's name on the screen, I smiled without thinking because that's what mothers do. We smile first and ask questions later, and his voice was bright, rushed. Excited, the kind of voice you use when you're already halfway somewhere else, and he said, almost laughing, "Mom, I'm getting married tomorrow." And I remember thinking, "Ah, tomorrow, that's sudden," but before I could even respond. Before I could say congratulations or ask where or who or why tomorrow, he kept talking, words tumbling over each other like they didn't matter. "I took all the money from your bank accounts," he said casually. Like he was telling me he borrowed my charger, and there was a pause, just long enough for my brain to fail to catch up, and then he added, "I sold the house too." Bye, and the line went dead. No apology, no explanation, no space for my voice, just silence buzzing in my ear. And for a second, maybe longer, I stood there holding the phone like it might start speaking again if I waited. My heart thudding once hard, then slowing, my mind trying to understand the words in the right order, took the money, sold the house, tomorrow, wedding, bye, and the kettle kept screaming on the stove as if nothing important had happened at all. And that's when something unexpected happened, something that even surprised me. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't drop to the floor like you see in movies. Instead, a small sound escaped my mouth, a short, breathy laugh, ha ha ha. The kind that slips out when your mind is protecting you from breaking too fast, and I laughed again, a little louder, my hands shaking now, because somewhere deep inside, under the shock and the sting and the disbelief, a thought was forming. Slow and sharp like ice spreading in water, and that thought was, he thinks he knows everything. I turned off the kettle, sat down at the kitchen table, and stared at the wall, my reflection faintly visible in the dark screen of the television. An older woman with calm eyes that didn't match the chaos starting to move inside her chest, and I thought, what kind of son calls his mother like that? What kind of child hears his own voice say those words and doesn't stop? Doesn't hesitate, doesn't think maybe I should explain, maybe I should soften this, maybe I should care, and the more I replayed his tone in my head, the more it hurt, not because of the money, not yet, but because of how easy it sounded for him, how light, how free, like he'd already decided I was just background noise in his new life. And that's when the questions started creeping in, the ones that don't shout but whisper. The dangerous ones, like when did he stop seeing me as his mother? When did I become a problem to solve instead of a person? And how long had he been planning this while I was folding his childhood memories into neat boxes in my head? Sigh, I looked around the kitchen, the small chips in the counter, the chair he used to sit on when he was little, legs swinging. Asking for cereal at midnight, and I felt something tighten in my throat. All because I had raised him alone, I had worked late shifts, skipped holidays, said no to myself so I could say yes to him. And this was how he chose to begin his marriage, by ending my sense of safety with a phone call that lasted less than a minute. And still, even then, even with my heart starting to ache in that deep, heavy way, I didn't feel weak. I felt still, too still, like the moment just before a storm breaks, and that scared me more than anger would have, because anger burns out, but stillness thinks, and I sat there asking myself questions I never imagined I'd have to ask. Like, do you scream now or later? Do you call him back or let him believe he's won? Do you act like a hurt mother or a foolish one? And as those questions rolled through me, another thought settled in. Quieter but stronger than the rest, he didn't even check, did he? He didn't ask, he didn't confirm. He just assumed, and that assumption, that careless confidence, was what made my lips curve again, just slightly, not because I was amused, but because I realized something important, something he had completely missed, and no, I wasn't ready to say it out loud yet, not even to myself, because the moment I did, everything would change, the way I spoke, the way I moved, the way this story would end. So instead, I took a deep breath, wiped my eyes even though no tears had fallen yet, and whispered to the empty kitchen, "You really think you took everything, and if you're listening to me right now, ask yourself this: what would you do if the person you trusted most betrayed you so calmly? Would you break, or would you go quiet like I did? Because silence isn't always surrender. Sometimes it's the sound of someone realizing they still have one card left to play." And as I sat there, phone face down on the table, heart steadying, a strange certainty settled in my bones. He had no idea what he'd just done. And the truth he didn't know, the one detail he missed, was already waiting for him, patient, unmoving, and far more powerful than he could imagine. Before you judge what my son did that morning, before you decide he was always cruel or always selfish, let me take you back, because betrayals like this don't fall from the sky. They're grown slowly, quietly. Watered with trust and guilt and love that never learned how to say no, sigh. And I didn't realize that at the time, of course, I thought I was just being a good mother, the kind people praise, the kind who sacrifices without counting, who gives without keeping score. And maybe that's where it all began, because when my husband died suddenly and far too young, it was just me and my son against the world. And I remember standing in the hallway after the funeral, holding his small hand, promising him that everything would be okay, even though I had no idea how I would make that true. And for years after that, I worked, I worried, I smiled when I was tired. I told him stories at night, even when my eyes burned, ha ha ha, and he grew up watching me solve problems quietly, without drama, without help. And I think somewhere along the way, he learned the wrong lesson. He learned that his mother was strong enough to handle anything, which slowly turned into the belief that whatever he did, I would absorb it, fix it, survive it. And when he got older, when he became confident and charming and ambitious, I felt proud, I truly did, all because he wasn't reckless, he was smart, people liked him, trusted him, and I trusted him too, maybe more than I should have, especially when it came to money, because I never liked talking about it. Never liked drawing lines, and when he first asked about my finances, it didn't feel wrong, it felt responsible. He said things like, "Mom, you shouldn't worry about this stuff alone, and I just want to make sure you're okay." And when someone says that in a caring tone, you don't hear danger, you hear love. So when he offered to help set up online banking, I let him sit beside me at the table, showing me screens I barely understood, clicking buttons with confidence, explaining things fast, and I nodded along, trusting that he knew what he was doing, because he always had, right, and when he asked for account details later, saying it would make things easier if something ever happened to me, I hesitated for a second, just a second, and then that old guilt crept in, the one that whispers, "Don't be difficult, don't act suspicious, this is your son." And so I gave him access, telling myself it was practical, telling myself it was love, telling myself that if I didn't trust my own child, who could I trust? And at first, nothing happened, weeks went by, months even. And life stayed the same, which is how trust tightens its grip, not by doing something bad right away, but by doing nothing at all until you stop watching, and then came small comments, things I brushed off. Like him mentioning how expensive houses had become, how lucky I was to own one, how people my age should enjoy life instead of worrying about savings. And I remember laughing, saying, "Old habits die hard." While he smiled in a way I didn't fully notice then, a smile that felt more like calculation than warmth, but I ignored that feeling, because mothers are very good at ignoring feelings that threaten the image they hold of their children. Cyan, when he introduced me to the woman he would later marry, she was polite, charming in a sharp way, always looking around the room when she visited, not at me but at the things around me, the furniture, the walls, the quiet. And she asked questions that felt innocent on the surface, like how long I'd lived there, whether I ever thought of moving, whether managing a house alone was tiring, and I answered kindly because that's who I am. Even when my stomach tightened just a little, and still, even then, I didn't connect the dots, because dots only look obvious after the picture is complete, and the truth is, I had trained my son without meaning to believe that my boundaries were flexible, that my comfort came second, that my resources were shared by default, because I had always been there to catch him when he fell, to soften the consequences, to say, "It's okay," even when it wasn't. And over time, that unconditional support turned into silent permission, permission he never asked for but slowly took, step by step. And here's the part that hurts the most to admit, the reason I didn't question him more. The reason I didn't double check, the reason I didn't protect myself sooner, is because I didn't want to become the kind of mother who needed protecting from her own child. I didn't want to believe that story, so I chose a simpler one. A safer one, the story where my son loved me and was just trying to help, ha ha ha. Funny how comforting lies can be, until they collapse. And now, sitting here telling you this, I see it clearly. The trust wasn't broken in one moment. It was slowly reshaped, gently bent, until it snapped under the weight of his wedding plans and his hunger for a new life. And the call you heard about, the one that changed everything, that wasn't the beginning of the betrayal. It was just the moment he finally said out loud what he'd been practicing quietly for a long time. And as that realization settled in me, heavy and undeniable, another thought followed close behind, one that made my chest tighten again. Because if he had been planning this for so long, if he had been so confident, so certain, then what else had he assumed? What else had he failed to check? And as I sat there, remembering every small moment I had ignored, every question I hadn't asked, I felt that same strange, calm return, the kind that comes when you realize the story isn't over yet, because someone who underestimates you once usually does it again, and that second mistake. That's the one that changes everything. I wish I could tell you that after the call, after the shock settled, I stood up strong and immediately took action. But the truth is messier than that, sigh, because the first thing I did was nothing, absolutely nothing. I just sat there at the kitchen table with my hands folded like I was waiting for instructions from someone who never came. my phone lying face down as if it had betrayed me too. And for a while, I tried to convince myself that maybe I'd misunderstood, maybe I'd heard him wrong, maybe stress and excitement had twisted his words. Ha ha ha. It's amazing how the mind will work overtime to protect the heart. And that's when I decided to check, not because I wanted proof, but because I wanted relief. I opened my laptop the same way I always did, slow, familiar, Sunday morning habits, even though it wasn't Sunday. Typing in passwords I knew by muscle memory, expecting the screen to reassure me, to say everything is fine, you imagined it. But instead, the numbers stared back at me wrong, deeply wrong, and for a moment my brain refused to process them. Like when you see a typo and keep rereading it, hoping it will correct itself. My savings account, the one I'd built over decades, the one I touched only for emergencies, showed a balance so small it looked like a mistake. And my checking account, usually steady and predictable, was almost empty, just a few lonely digits sitting there like they were ashamed to exist. And I blinked hard, leaned closer to the screen, refreshed the page, then refreshed it again. As if the internet might apologize and fix itself, but it didn't. The numbers stayed exactly where they were. And that's when my chest tightened, not sharply, but slowly, like a hand closing around my lungs. Ah. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, loud and uneven, and my fingers started to tremble as I scrolled down the transaction list, line after line of withdrawals, transfers, amounts that made my stomach flip. All leading to the same place, the same name, my son's name, printed there in clean, neutral font. No judgment, no explanation, just facts, and I remember whispering, no, 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 no. Like saying it enough times might turn it into truth, but it didn't because facts don't care about hope. And that's when I called the bank, my voice trying very hard to sound normal while my insides were unraveling. And the woman on the other end was kind, professional, calm in that practiced way. And she asked me to confirm my identity, my address, my birthday, questions I'd answered 100 times before, but now they felt strange. Like I was proving I still existed, and when she finally said, "Yes, ma'am, I see the transactions," my heart sank, and she explained them carefully, gently, as if talking to someone fragile, authorized transfers, online access. Linked accounts, and then she said his name, asking, "Is Derek Thornton your son?" And something inside me cracked, not loudly, not in a dramatic way, but quietly, like a thin line spreading through glass, and I couldn't answer her. I just sat there with the phone pressed to my ear, staring at the wall, my mouth open but no sound coming out. Because how do you explain that the person who did this is the same one whose scraped knees you kissed better? And when I finally hung up, I didn't cry, not yet. I sat back in my chair and laughed again, a dry, hollow laugh, ha ha ha, because the absurdity of it all suddenly hit me. My son hadn't just taken money, he had taken certainty. Safety, the illusion that love automatically protects you, and the house came back into my thoughts like a dull ache. The place I thought was solid, permanent, untouchable, and I felt a wave of fear then, real fear. The kind that makes you think about boxes and moving trucks and being old and unwanted. And for a brief moment, I let myself imagine it, standing outside with nowhere to go, explaining to strangers that my own child had taken everything, and my eyes finally filled, tears blurring the screen in front of me. But even as they fell, something strange happened. Alongside the fear came clarity. Because as I stared at those transactions again, at the neat certainty with which he'd emptied my accounts, I realized how confident he must have been, how sure, how careless, and that confidence told me more than the numbers ever could. It told me he believed I wouldn't fight back, that I wouldn't understand, that I would panic and freeze and accept whatever story he fed me next. And that assumption, that single careless belief, settled heavily in my chest. Because people who assume you're powerless always stop looking for resistance. And that's when I wiped my face, closed the laptop, and sat there breathing slowly, deliberately, like I was steadying myself before stepping into cold water. Because now it wasn't just about missing money or a house or a wedding tomorrow. It was about something deeper, something harder. It was about being underestimated. And I knew, with a certainty that surprised me, that the next move mattered more than any scream or accusation ever could. And as I sat there in that quiet kitchen, the loss finally sinking in, one thought repeated itself over and over, steady as a drumbeat. He thinks I've noticed too late. He thinks I'm already defeated, and that thought, more than anything else, told me this story was far from over. After I closed the laptop, after the numbers burned themselves into my memory, I didn't rush anywhere. I didn't grab my keys or start dialing people in a panic. Instead, I sat there longer than I probably should have, listening to the house breathe around me, the low hum of the refrigerator, the faint tick of the clock on the wall, sigh, because when something is taken from you so suddenly, your mind needs time to catch up to your body. And mine was still stuck somewhere between disbelief and dread. And that's when the house itself started to feel different, heavier somehow, like it was listening too, like it knew it had been mentioned, sold, dismissed in a sentence that ended with bye. And I stood up slowly and walked from room to room, touching things without realizing I was doing it. The edge of the table, the door frame, the light switch, grounding myself. And I kept hearing his voice in my head, so sure, so final. I sold the house as if houses were just numbers on a screen, as if walls and memories and years could be transferred with a click, and the fear crept in again, sharp this time, because a house isn't just property. It's proof that you belong somewhere, and I thought, where would I go? What would I do? How do you explain to the world that your own child erased your stability overnight? And I felt tears rise again, threatening to spill, but before they could. Another thought interrupted them, quiet but insistent, like someone tapping you on the shoulder, and it said, wait, slow down, think. And I stopped in the doorway of the living room, my heart still pounding, and tried to replay the details carefully. Not emotionally, not as a mother, but as a woman who had lived a long life and learned a few things along the way, and I realized something small but important. He had said the house, not my house, not the address, just the house. As if there was only one, as if everything I owned existed in one simple box he could empty. And that assumption, that careless shorthand, made me sit down again, my pulse slowing just a little, ha ha ha. Because assumptions are dangerous things, especially when they're made by people who don't know the full story. And as I sat there, staring at the familiar crack in the wall near the window, I let my mind wander back, not to the betrayal, but to decisions I'd made years ago, practical ones, boring ones, the kind no one remembers because they don't seem dramatic at the time, like paperwork, signatures, conversations with lawyers that felt unnecessary back then. And slowly, piece by piece, the picture became clearer, and with it, a strange sense of control returned, not relief, not joy, but control, the kind that steadies your hands because the truth was the house he thought he sold. The one he was so proud of taking off my hands wasn't the place I was standing in now. And no, this wasn't some clever trick or secret plan I'd made with revenge in mind. It was simply life. Layered and complicated in ways he had never bothered to understand. Years ago, after my husband's death, I had made careful choices, separating things, protecting myself quietly, not because I was suspicious, but because I believed in being prepared. And one of those choices involved property, involved names and titles and structures that weren't obvious to someone who only glanced at the surface, and my son had always glanced. Never looked closely, he had seen what was convenient for him to see and filled in the rest with confidence. And as that realization settled in, the fear I'd been holding began to shift, not disappear, but change shape. Like ice melting into water. Because now I wasn't imagining boxes and moving trucks anymore. I was imagining questions, serious ones, questions he would soon be asked by people who didn't care that he was someone's son. People who dealt in facts, not family, and I felt a chill then, not fear for myself, but for him, because selling something you don't truly understand isn't bold, it's reckless, and recklessness always leaves a trail. And I remember leaning back in my chair, letting out a shaky breath and laughing again, softly this time, ha ha ha, not because anything was funny, but because the irony was almost painful. He thought he'd taken my foundation. But all he'd really done was reveal how little he knew about my life. And that's a dangerous thing, to underestimate someone who has been quietly managing complexity for decades. Someone who learned long ago that security doesn't come from loud power, but from careful planning. And as I sat there, the weight of what he'd done still pressing on my chest, I also felt something else rising underneath it, something steadier. Something colder resolve, because now the story wasn't just about money or a house or even betrayal. It was about consequences, and whether he realized it or not, by selling what he thought was mine. He had stepped into a mess far bigger than either of us, and I wasn't the one who would suffer the most from it. And that understanding, slow and undeniable, made me straighten my back, wipe my face, and whisper to myself, you should have asked. Because from that moment on, I knew one thing for certain: his confidence was built on ignorance, and ignorance, sooner or later, always collapses. Once that realization settled in, once the fear stopped screaming and started whispering, I knew rushing would be my biggest mistake, Sai, because panic makes noise and noise attracts the wrong kind of attention, and I didn't need drama. I needed clarity, so I did something that surprised even me. I slowed down deliberately, like pressing a pause button on my own emotions. And I told myself, not yet, don't move yet, think first. Because every loud reaction would only confirm what he already believed, that I was overwhelmed, confused, powerless, and I refused to give him that satisfaction, ha ha ha. Instead, I made myself a cup of tea. Even though my hands were still trembling, because habits have a way of anchoring you when the ground feels unstable. And I sat at the table again, notebook in front of me, pen resting between my fingers, and I started writing. Not feelings, not accusations, just facts, dates, names, memories, the kind of quiet details that don't seem important until they suddenly are. And as I wrote, my thoughts became sharper, more focused. Like fog lifting slowly from a road, I wrote down the day he first asked about my accounts, the week he mentioned automatic payments, the casual confidence with which he spoke about my finances as if they were already shared. And then I wrote about the house, not emotionally, not sentimentally, but structurally, who signed what, when, and why, and with each line I felt steadier. Ah, because facts don't betray you, people do, and I realized something else too. Something painful but necessary. If I confronted him now, if I called him back screaming or crying or demanding answers, I would lose control of the situation immediately. He would spin a story, minimize, guilt me. Maybe even scare me, and worse, he would start preparing defenses before I fully understood my own position. And I didn't want that. I wanted him relaxed, careless, convinced he had already won. Because people make their worst mistakes when they think the game is over. And as I sat there planning quietly, another wave of emotion hit me. Heavier this time, grief not for the money, not even for the house, but for the son I thought I knew. The one who used to run to the door when I came home late, the one who once cried because he thought he'd disappointed me, and I let myself feel that pain fully for a moment, tears slipping down my face. Ah. Because denying it would only poison me later, and I whispered, "Why didn't you just ask?" Knowing full well that asking wouldn't have given him what he wanted, and that's the part that hurt the most. He didn't want help, he wanted control. And control doesn't ask, it takes. And when the tears finally stopped, I wiped my face and looked around the kitchen again, noticing how calm everything still was, how unchanged. And it struck me how strange it is that your entire world can collapse internally while the outside stays exactly the same. And that's when I made another decision, a hard one. I decided I would not tell anyone yet, not friends. Not neighbors, not even distant family, because sympathy can be dangerous when you're not ready. It clouds judgment, invites opinions, and I needed my mind clear, my strategy clean, and my next steps quiet. So instead of reaching for the phone, I reached for old folders, the ones tucked away in drawers and cabinets, the ones labeled in my handwriting from years ago. Boring labels, uninteresting to anyone else, but to me they were anchors. Proof that I hadn't lived carelessly. And as I pulled them out one by one, stacking them neatly, I felt something unexpected, pride, not arrogance, not smugness, but pride in the woman I had been before this happened, the woman who planned, who prepared, who didn't put all her eggs in one basket just because love told her to, and that pride softened the shame I'd been carrying, because yes, I had trusted him too much, but I hadn't been foolish in every part of my life. And that mattered now more than ever, and I thought about calling the bank again, about reporting things immediately, but even that I held back because timing matters, and once certain doors open, they don't close quietly. And I wanted to walk through them when I was ready, not when fear pushed me. And as the afternoon light shifted across the floor, I sat there breathing slowly, counting my breaths like I used to during stressful moments years ago. And I reminded myself of something important, something I had learned the hard way long before my son ever betrayed me. Control doesn't come from reacting. It comes from choosing when to act, and I smiled then, just a little ha-ha-ha. Because he had acted quickly, impulsively, driven by excitement and greed and confidence. And I was doing the opposite. I was moving slowly, deliberately, like someone who knows the terrain better than the person charging ahead. And I could almost see it now, the point where his story would start unraveling, not with shouting, not with drama, but with questions he wouldn't be able to answer. And that image gave me strength because for the first time since the call, I wasn't imagining myself as a victim scrambling to recover. I was imagining myself as a witness watching a trap close. And as I gathered the last folder and placed it carefully on the table, I felt that cold, steady resolve settle fully into place, the kind that doesn't shake because I knew the next phase was coming, the phase where silence would end and consequences would begin. And when that happened, he would finally realize that my quiet wasn't weakness at all, it was preparation, and he was about to learn exactly what he'd triggered when he decided to take what he never truly understood. By the time the wedding day arrived, I had practiced my calm so well it almost felt real, sigh, the kind of calm that sits on your face while your thoughts keep moving underneath. And when I stood in front of the mirror that morning, adjusting a simple dress, I barely recognized the woman looking back at me, not because she looked broken, but because she looked composed in a way that surprised even herself. And I remember thinking, if anyone could see inside me right now, they'd hear 1,000 questions shouting at once, but on the outside there was only stillness, and that was exactly how I wanted it because panic would have given him power. And I was done handing him anything for free, so I drove to the venue slowly, hands steady on the wheel, watching the familiar roads pass by like nothing in the world had changed. And when I arrived, the place was beautiful in that polished, expensive way, white flowers everywhere, soft music floating through the air, laughter spilling from groups of guests who had no idea what kind of foundation this celebration was built on. And as I stepped inside, the noise hit me all at once. Voices, clinking glasses, happiness on display, and for a second my chest tightened, awe because it felt surreal to watch joy funded by my loss, but I reminded myself, stay present, stay quiet, this is part of it. And when my son saw me, his face lit up instantly, relief flickering across it so fast he probably didn't realize it showed. And he hugged me tightly, too tightly, saying, I'm so glad you came, Mom, and I hugged him back. Breathing in the scent of his cologne, the same boy, the same arms, and yet not the same person at all. And I congratulated him, my voice even warm enough to be believable. And if you're wondering how I managed that, how I stood there smiling while my heart felt like it had been rearranged, it's because sometimes survival means acting like everything is fine until the moment it matters most, ha ha ha, and as the day unfolded. I watched him move through the crowd with confidence, shaking hands, laughing loudly, playing the role of a man who believed he had secured his future. And I watched his new wife too, graceful, sharp-eyed, her gaze sweeping the room like she was already calculating what came next, and she smiled at me in that polite, distant way, the kind that doesn't quite reach the eyes, and I smiled back because I knew something she didn't. And knowing something quietly is a strange kind of power. The ceremony itself was short, vows spoken, promises made, words about trust and loyalty floating through the air, and I felt a sting then, sharp and sudden, because hearing those words from my son felt like salt on an open wound. But I stayed seated, hands folded, face calm, letting the moment pass without stealing attention from it, because this wasn't about revenge in public. It was about consequences in private, and at the reception I held a glass I barely drank from, nodded through conversations I barely heard, the music thumping softly beneath everything, and at one point, as I watched guests dancing, laughing, celebrating, I thought about how easily people assume happiness is honest just because it's loud. And if you're listening to me right now, let me say this gently, if stories like this make you think, make you look twice at the people you trust most, stay with me and subscribe, because sometimes the quiet stories are the ones that matter the most. And as the evening wore on, my son came over again, leaning close, his voice low, asking, Everything okay, Mom? And I met his eyes and said, yes, simply because it wasn't a lie, not anymore. Everything was okay, just not in the way he thought. And as the cake was cut and the cheers rose around us, my phone vibrated softly in my hand, unnoticed by anyone else, and I didn't need to look at it right away to know what it meant, because timing has a way of announcing itself, and when I finally glanced down, my breath caught just slightly, not in fear, but in recognition, because what I had been quietly preparing for was beginning to move on its own, and I slipped my phone back into my bag without reacting, without changing my expression. Letting him laugh, letting him believe this day belonged entirely to him, because sometimes the most powerful moment isn't when you confront someone, it's when you let them celebrate right before reality catches up. And as I stood there among the music and the lights, smiling politely, a single thought repeated itself in my mind, steady and unshakable. Enjoy this while you can, because when the silence breaks, it won't be me you'll have to answer to. And if you think staying calm in a moment like this is easy, it isn't. It takes everything you have, but I promise you this, the calm before consequences is far more frightening than any scream, and that's exactly where I was standing. Waiting, knowing the next chapter was already unfolding, and he had no idea how close it was. The silence after the wedding didn't last long. It never does, sigh, because silence makes people nervous, especially people who believe they've done something risky and gotten away with it. And 3 days later, my phone rang again. His name lighting up the screen like it always had, only this time I didn't feel that automatic warmth. I felt distance, a strange emotional gap, like I was watching a scene instead of living inside it. And when I answered, his voice was different, sharp around the edges, confidence cracking just enough to let panic slip through, and he didn't bother with greetings, didn't ask how I was, he jumped straight in. Why is the bank calling me? He demanded. Why are they asking questions about fraud? And I leaned back in my chair, letting his words settle, letting him talk himself into revealing more than he meant to, and I said calmly, they noticed the transfers. Because I wanted to hear what excuse he would choose first, and he laughed, forced and quick, ha ha ha, the laugh of someone trying to outrun fear. That's normal, he said, just call them and tell them it's fine, tell them you approved it. And there it was, the expectation laid bare, the belief that I would clean up after him like I always had, that I would smooth things over, take responsibility for his choices, and I asked softly, why would I do that? And the pause on the line stretched longer than before, heavy, and then his tone shifted, becoming harder, defensive. Because you're my mother, he snapped. You gave me access, you wanted me to help, and I closed my eyes for a moment. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because hearing him rewrite reality so easily hurt in a way I hadn't prepared for. And I said, helping doesn't mean emptying my accounts. And that's when the mask slipped further, his voice rising. Frustration spilling out, you're overreacting, he said. You don't even need that money right now, it's just sitting there, as if years of discipline and planning were meaningless, as if my future was optional. And something cold settled in my chest then, because entitlement sounds different when you finally hear it clearly. And before I could respond, he added almost casually, and the house thing is done. So don't make this harder than it needs to be. And I felt a strange mix of sadness and resolve because he still believed that part. He still believed the house was gone, that I was already displaced. And I realized then how little he truly understood what he'd set in motion. And I said quietly, "Who told you the sale went through?" And he hesitated just a fraction before answering, "The title company." And my lips curved into a small smile he couldn't see, because I knew that wasn't entirely true anymore. And when I didn't respond right away, he grew agitated. "Mom, listen," he said, lowering his voice as if kindness might work better. "Let's not ruin this. It's done. We're married now. I'll take care of you, okay? Take care of me." The phrase echoed bitterly, because it was the same one he'd used when he first asked for access. And now it sounded less like care and more like control, and I finally said, "I'm not calling the bank." And the reaction was immediate, explosive, his voice sharp and loud. "Are you serious?" he shouted. "Do you know what you're doing?" And I held the phone away from my ear slightly, waiting for the storm to pass, because anger reveals things people hide when they're calm, and sure enough, he kept going, threatening without quite realizing it, talking about lawyers. About how messy things could get, about how people might start questioning my competence if this went further. And there it was, the line he crossed without hesitation, suggesting I couldn't manage my own life. And that hurt more than anything else he'd said. Because it wasn't just theft anymore, it was an attempt to erase my autonomy. And when he finally paused to breathe, I said firmly, "Don't speak to me like that." And my voice surprised even me, steady, unshaking, and there was silence on the other end now, not the comfortable kind, but the brittle kind, the kind that precedes a shift in power, and he asked, quieter now, "What are you doing?" And I answered honestly, "I'm letting this be handled properly." And that's when his fear fully surfaced, no longer disguised as confidence or anger, but raw and desperate. "You wouldn't," he said, almost pleading, "you wouldn't do this to me." And I closed my eyes again, feeling the weight of that sentence, because he still thought this was something I was doing to him, not something he'd done to himself. And I said, "You already did this," and the call ended shortly after. Not with a goodbye, but with a sharp disconnect, and I sat there holding the phone for a long moment, my hands slightly numb, my heart heavy. Because as painful as that conversation was, it confirmed what I needed to know: he wasn't confused. He wasn't remorseful, he was only afraid of consequences, and that distinction matters more than people realize. And later that afternoon, as if on cue, another message arrived, this time from someone else. A polite email filled with professional language, words like irregularities and documentation and review. And as I read it, I felt that same cold resolve deepen, because things were moving now, not because I pushed them, but because truth has a way of surfacing once it's disturbed. And I leaned back, exhaled slowly, and let myself feel the full weight of it, the grief, the disappointment. The quiet heartbreak of realizing your child is capable of hurting you without hesitation. And if you're listening to me and thinking you'd never survive something like this, let me tell you something. Survival doesn't look like strength at first. It looks like sitting quietly while the world rearranges itself around a truth you can't ignore anymore. And as the evening settled in and the light faded from the room, I understood something clearly for the first time. This wasn't just a family conflict spiraling out of control. This was the moment when the story stopped being private. And once that happens, there's no going back, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that the next knock on his door wouldn't be from me. And that realization, heavy and final, told me the most difficult part was still ahead. When they showed up at my door, I wasn't surprised. I think that's what shocked me the most, Sai, because some part of me had been expecting it, like your body senses a storm before the sky darkens. And I was standing in the kitchen rinsing a cup when I heard the knock, firm, impatient, the kind that assumes it will be answered. And I dried my hands slowly, deliberately, giving myself those few extra seconds to breathe, to steady my shoulders, to remind myself that whatever was about to be said, I didn't owe anyone panic. And when I opened the door, they were both there, my son and his wife, standing side by side like a united front, his jaw tight, her expression carefully arranged into something polite but sharp, and the air between us felt thick immediately. Because this wasn't a visit, it was a confrontation dressed up as concern, and before I could say anything, he stepped forward, voice raised just enough to feel threatening without being obvious. "What did you do?" he demanded. Not hello, not how are you, just accusation. And I looked at him for a long moment, really looked, noticing how tense he was, how his confidence now felt brittle, like glass ready to crack. And I said calmly, "You should lower your voice," and that seemed to surprise him, because he expected fear, not boundaries, ha ha ha. And that's when she spoke, stepping in smoothly, her tone softer but her words sharper. "We're just trying to understand what's going on," she said, glancing around the house as if inspecting it. "Things are getting complicated, and stress isn't good for anyone, especially at your age." And there it was, the subtle insult wrapped in concern, the quiet attempt to place me beneath them, and something inside me hardened, not with anger, but with clarity, and I said, I understand exactly what's going on, and my son scoffed. Shaking his head, then why are you letting this get so far? He snapped. Do you know what people are saying? Do you know what this could do to me? And I almost laughed then, ha ha ha, because even now, even standing in my doorway after everything, his world still revolved around himself, his reputation, his inconvenience, and I asked him, do you know what it did to me? And he hesitated. Just long enough to answer the wrong question. I told you I'd take care of you, he said, frustration spilling out. You don't need to make this a legal mess. And his wife's patience cracked at that point, her voice rising. Losing its smooth edge, let's be honest, she said. You're being difficult. This could all be handled quietly if you just cooperate, as if theft was a misunderstanding, as if silence was my duty. And I felt a wave of sadness wash over me then, not because of what they were saying, but because of how easily they said it, how entitled they felt to my compliance. And when I didn't respond immediately, she leaned closer. Lowering her voice, you don't want people questioning your judgment, she added. Things like this make people wonder if someone your age can really manage everything alone, and that was the moment. The exact second the last piece fell into place, because threats disguised as concern are still threats, and I straightened, meeting her eyes, my voice calm but firm. Are you trying to intimidate me? And she blinked. Clearly not expecting to be called out so plainly, my son jumped in, anger flaring. Stop twisting things, he said. We're trying to protect you, protect me. The irony almost hurt, and I shook my head slowly. You're trying to protect yourselves, and the room went quiet, the kind of quiet that follows truth, and he took a step closer then, invading my space, his voice low and sharp. If you keep this up, he said, things will get ugly. And my heart pounded once hard, not from fear, but from grief, because this was my child speaking to me like an enemy, and I took a breath and said, get out of my house, and both of them froze as if the words hadn't registered. So I repeated it louder, steadier, leave, and his wife laughed, a short, bitter sound, ha ha ha. You'll regret this, she snapped. When everyone turns on you, don't say we didn't try. And my son looked at me then, really looked. His anger shifting into something darker. You're choosing this, he said, pointing at me. Remember that. And I nodded because for the first time that part was true. Yes, I said, I am, and they left in a rush of movement and slammed doors. Their footsteps fading down the path, and I stood there alone in the doorway, my legs suddenly weak, my hands trembling now that the moment had passed. Because strength doesn't mean you don't feel it, it means you feel it and stand anyway. And I closed the door slowly, leaning my forehead against it for a second, letting the reality sink in, the threats, the manipulation, the complete lack of remorse, and I knew then, without doubt, that this wasn't about a mistake or desperation. This was about character, and character doesn't change just because it's exposed. And as I walked back into the quiet of my home, the silence felt different now, heavier but cleaner. Because whatever hope I'd been holding onto had finally let go, and that hurt deeply, but it also freed me, because there was no more confusion left, no more wondering if I was overreacting, no more space for guilt to creep in. And as I sat down and took a long, shaky breath, I realized something important. The mask was gone, and once people show you who they really are, the only choice left is what you do with that truth, and I had already made mine. After that day, everything moved faster than I expected, sigh, not because I pushed it, but because once the truth is exposed, it doesn't like to sit still, and I felt it immediately, the shift from private pain to public reality. The moment when what happened inside my home began echoing outward into offices, emails, phone calls, conversations that no longer involved just me and my son, and that was harder than I imagined, because when consequences arrive, they don't come quietly, they come layered with paperwork, deadlines, formal language, and strangers asking you to relive the worst moments of your life in neat, organized sentences, and I remember sitting at my table again. Documents spread out like pieces of a life I never planned to explain, answering questions calmly while my chest felt tight. Because there's something deeply unsettling about hearing your own story repeated back to you by people who have no emotional connection to it. And yet, with every confirmation, every verified detail, something inside me steadied. Because this was no longer about opinions or emotions, it was about facts, and facts have weight, and my son felt that weight almost immediately. His messages changed tone, shifting from anger to urgency, from threats to pleas. His voice breaking when he finally called again, saying my name the way he used to when he was scared as a child, and for a brief moment, just a brief one, my heart twisted, because that sound still lived deep inside me. But then he started explaining, not apologizing, explaining, talking about stress, pressure, bad influence, as if responsibility could be passed around like a burden no one wanted to carry, and I listened quietly. Because listening costs nothing, but believing costs everything, and when he finished, waiting for my response, I said only, this is bigger than us now. and the silence on the line told me he finally understood what that meant. Because once something leaves the family space and enters the real world, it doesn't bend for guilt or love, and the days that followed were a blur of updates, notifications, confirmations. Each one closing another door he'd hoped would stay open, and I learned things I never wanted to learn, like how quickly people distance themselves when trouble arrives, how confidence evaporates when accountability shows up, and how fear sounds when it finally runs out of places to hide. And I heard it in his voice when he called one last time, not to argue, not to threaten, but to ask quietly, "Is there anything I can do?" And I sat there holding the phone, staring at the wall, my throat tight, because that question came too late, not because I wanted punishment, but because repair requires honesty first, and he hadn't shown me that, and I answered truthfully. "You should have asked that before," and hung up, my hand shaking afterward. Because choosing yourself doesn't feel powerful in the moment, it feels lonely. And as everything settled into motion, I felt grief rise again, not sharp this time, but heavy and dull, the grief of losing the idea of who your child was supposed to be, the grief of accepting that love doesn't guarantee integrity, and there were nights I lay awake wondering if I'd gone too far. If silence would have been easier, if forgiveness would have spared me this ache, but then I remembered his words, his certainty, his threats, the way he stood in my doorway demanding compliance. And I knew that stepping back now would only teach him one thing, that consequences are optional if you push hard enough. And I couldn't live with that, not for him and not for myself. And as the situation reached its unavoidable conclusion, I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, just a quiet finality, the understanding that some lessons arrive wrapped in loss, and that justice, real justice, doesn't feel like victory. It feels like closing a door you wish you didn't have to close, and when the calls stopped and the house returned to its familiar quiet, I sat alone at my table again, the same place where this all began, and I let myself cry then. Truly cry, weeping not for what I'd lost materially, but for the relationship that would never return to what it was. And if you're listening to me and wondering how you'd survive something like this, let me tell you something gently. Survival doesn't mean you walk away untouched. It means you walk forward anyway, carrying the weight without letting it crush you. And as the days passed and the noise faded, one truth remained undeniable and steady. Consequences don't erase pain, but they do protect you from repeating it, and that realization, as painful as it was, prepared me for the final chapter of the story. The one where I had to learn who I was without the illusion I'd been holding onto for so long. When everything finally slowed down, when the calls stopped coming and the emails no longer carried new information, I found myself sitting in the same kitchen where it had all begun, and the quiet felt different now, sigh, not empty. Not peaceful exactly, but settled like dust after a long collapse, and I realized that what remained wasn't relief. It was space, space where panic used to live, space where excuses no longer echoed. And in that space, I had to face something much harder than anger or betrayal. I had to face myself, all because for weeks I had been reacting, thinking, preparing, surviving, and now there was nothing left to do but feel. And that's when the grief truly arrived, not in dramatic waves, but in slow moments, like reaching for the phone to tell him something small and realizing there was no one on the other end anymore. Or passing by a store window and remembering how proud I once felt when I imagined sharing future milestones, grandchildren, holidays, ordinary joy, and I won't lie, I cried. I wept quietly on nights when the house felt too large, when the silence pressed in from all sides, because even when someone hurts you deeply, losing the relationship you believed in still feels like a kind of death, a strange, cruel one where the person is still alive but the bond is gone, and yet mixed in with that grief was something unexpected, a calm strength I didn't know I still had because I hadn't folded. I hadn't erased myself to keep someone else comfortable, and that mattered more than I ever realized before. And as days turned into weeks, I began to see my life differently, not as something that had been taken from me, but as something I still owned fully, and I started doing small things again, tending to my routine, walking in the mornings, calling friends I'd neglected, laughing softly at silly things without guilt. And each small step felt like reclaiming territory I didn't know I'd lost. And I thought a lot about motherhood, about love, about how easily we confuse sacrifice with obligation, and how dangerous that can be. Because loving someone doesn't mean surrendering your dignity, and family doesn't mean immunity from accountability. And if there's one lesson this experience carved into me, it's that boundaries are not punishment, they're protection. Not just from others, but from becoming someone you don't recognize anymore. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is stop rescuing the person who keeps choosing to drown, and that realization didn't make me cold. It made me honest, honest about what I could give and what I could no longer allow. And no, this ending isn't wrapped in happiness or forgiveness or dramatic reunions. It's wrapped in acceptance, the quiet kind. The kind that doesn't demand applause, because life doesn't always reward you with neat endings. Sometimes it rewards you with clarity instead, and clarity is enough. Because it lets you move forward without carrying someone else's guilt on your back. And as I sit here now, telling you this, I don't feel like a victim. I feel like a woman who learned something painful but necessary. That strength doesn't come from enduring everything, it comes from knowing when to stop. And if my story reaches you at a moment when you're questioning your own boundaries, your own worth, let it remind you of this. Protecting yourself isn't cruelty, it's survival, and choosing yourself doesn't mean you loved less. It means you finally loved wisely. And if stories like mine stay with you, make you reflect, make you feel seen, then stay with this channel and subscribe for more real stories, because you're not alone in these quiet battles. And before I go, let me ask you something. What would you have done if you were in my place? Would you have stayed silent to keep the peace? Or would you have found the courage to protect yourself, even if it meant losing someone you loved? Thank you for listening to my story, and remember this. Sometimes the detail someone misses isn't about money or property, it's the strength they never believed you had.